Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're getting into a really fascinating and pretty complex global issue. How exactly do we protect nonprofit organizations from the very dark reality of terrorist financing? It's a massive balancing act. And to really understand it, we're going to unpack a super targeted regulatory framework that recently came out of the jurisdiction of Jersey. The source material we have gives us an incredibly insightful blueprint, so let's just get right to it. Okay, let's dive into this. At the core of today's explainer, we're looking at a huge global paradox. On one hand, you have bad actors actively trying to hijack global financial systems. But on the other hand, you have charities performing literal life-saving work. If governments just throw a giant, suffocating regulatory net over everything, sure, the money for terrorists stops, but so does the money for food, medicine, and disaster relief. You see, nonprofits, or NPOs, do some of society's absolute most important work. We're talking humanitarian assistance, supporting vulnerable communities, funding critical medical treatments. These are the folks running toward earthquakes and conflict zones. But here's the catch. They often have to do this in places where commercial businesses and even governments simply can't operate. Because they do such vital work in such incredibly dangerous places, they face an immense operational risk. To break this all down, we're going to follow a quick 5-step roadmap. We'll look at the nonprofit dilemma, Jersey's specific risk-based solution, the actual threat of diversion, how to build resilient defenses, and finally, what global finance can learn from all this. So, Part 1, the nonprofit dilemma and risk in the crosshairs.
Here's the tricky part. The very things that make a charity effective, they're exactly what terrorist organizations want to exploit. Charities need to raise funds rapidly during emergencies. They have to operate across borders. They rely heavily on local partners to deliver aid right in the middle of conflict zones. And crucially, they often lack access to traditional banking because they're in failed states or disaster areas, which forces them to use cash or mobile money. Every single one of these operational necessities is a potential loophole for infiltration.
Moving on to Part 2, Jersey's risk-based solution, precision over paranoia. Jersey realized pretty quickly that they had to protect their nonprofit sector without completely paralyzing it, and they moved fast. They launched an engagement and registration campaign in January 2023, reaching out specifically to vulnerable organizations. By late 2023, they were already examining their first 8 NPOs. Going into early 2024, regulators shifted their focus heavily toward preventing the actual diversion of funds. And then, by mid-2024, this entire framework was assessed by Moneyval, which is a major European monitoring body.
Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast in the data. Jersey's National Risk Assessment found that a massive 90% of these organizations were just low or standard risk. Think of your local sports clubs, community associations, domestic charities. Only about 11% actually displayed characteristics of heightened vulnerability. Because Jersey leaned on this data, they were able to laser focus their controls only on that higher risk 11% instead of treating the entire charitable sector like some massive threat.
So how exactly do you define that risky 11%? Well, they created a specific legal category called a prescribed NPO. Just registering doesn't put a charity in this bucket. It only triggers if, over the last 12 months, the NPO raised or distributed more than £1,000 from outside Jersey, Guernsey, the Isle of Man, or Great Britain. Now, £1,000 is barely the cost of a laptop. It's very intentional. An overseas payment of that size isn't suspicious on its own. It's simply an indicator that the organization has international financial exposure. Once a charity hits that prescribed NPO status, they face some extra steps, like keeping really strict records on significant donors. A significant donor is basically anyone providing at least £10,000 in a year, or someone who makes up more than half of the organization's total donations. Again, major donors aren't inherently bad. Tracking these £10,000 plus donations just ensures a charity isn't unknowingly exposed to some undisclosed source trying to gain dangerous influence over their projects.
All right, Part 3, the threat of diversion. Let's look at the anatomy of a threat.
So what do we actually mean when we say diversion? Basically, it's when resources meant for a totally legitimate purpose get redirected so that a terrorist entity benefits, either directly or indirectly. But here is a fascinating takeaway from the sources. This abuse isn't just about cash. We're talking about vehicles, communications equipment, or even the charity's reputation getting hijacked through fraudulent social media campaigns to secretly collect money.
Let's see how this builds across the lifespan of a single donation. Diversion can actually happen before resources even leave the home jurisdiction. It can happen during the international transfer. It can be redirected the second a local partner receives it. But step 4 is where the vulnerability absolutely spikes, the point of distribution. That gap right between the immediate recipient and the ultimate beneficiary, that is the danger zone.
To put that into perspective on the ground, here's how this plays out in the real world. You could have terrorists creating sham charities to mask their recruitment. You might have a seemingly legitimate partner organization secretly inflating project expenses and just pocketing the difference. It could be local armed groups demanding unofficial taxes or access fees at checkpoints just to let food trucks pass. Or a well-meaning project could unknowingly buy supplies from someone linked to an armed group. It is incredibly messy out there. Which brings us to part 4, building resilient defenses, or the control stack. Now, a massive takeaway from Jersey's 2023 exams was this huge gap between two concepts. Yes, having written rules and risk assessments on paper, which is technical compliance, is important, but it honestly means nothing without effectiveness. A charity might have a beautifully written policy binder sitting on a desk, but if they can't definitively prove how their money was actually used by an overseas partner, they are completely failing to mitigate the risk. So the sources lay out this 8-layer control stack to actually prove that effectiveness. It starts at the top, a geographic assessment and a documented risk appetite, backed by strict trustee governance where they're actively approving the high-risk programs. Then you need transparent accounting to trace the funds, paired with really solid due diligence on partners. After that is the absolute most critical piece, end-use verification to confirm the delivery, supported by staff who are actually trained for their specific roles. And finally, you have to have clear escalation procedures for when things inevitably go wrong. It's essentially a comprehensive, shielded fortress. I really want to emphasize this specific point because it hits the nail on the head. Transferring money to a reputable partner does not end the originating organization's responsibility. It just changes the form of the control required. You cannot just wire funds to a local partner halfway across the world and hope for the best. You need project reports, you need receipts, photographs, independent audits. You have to verify that the final delivery actually happened.
Finally, Part 5, Lessons for Global Finance. Don't indiscriminately de-risk.
This brings up a huge issue in the financial world, indiscriminate de-risking. This is when banks get so terrified of massive fines that they just outright close the accounts of any charity operating in a high-risk area. But as the source points out, doing that just pushes completely legitimate, life-saving aid towards cash or informal transfer systems. By acting overly cautious, banks are actually reducing overall transparency and making the global financial system less safe. Instead of just panicking and shutting accounts down, financial crime leaders need to actively look at the right indicators. Banks have to understand an NPO's specific mission, who their donors are, and how they expect to make payments. They should be monitoring for anomalies, like sudden, totally unexplained shifts to new jurisdictions or just weird cash withdrawals. The big takeaway for finance is this: international humanitarian activity shouldn't be treated as suspicious merely because it's complex. Now, what if a charity actually suspects their funds are being diverted? They've got to follow 3 steps. First, use internal escalation processes so the staff knows exactly who to contact without putting themselves in danger. Second, protect the beneficiaries while preserving every piece of documentary evidence. And third, execute precise external reporting. It has to be based on facts. Unsupported allegations can completely ruin a legitimate community charity. But staying silent, that just lets bad actors keep exploiting the system.
Which brings us to a final thought. We've seen how Jersey successfully replaced blanket regulation with a targeted, heavily data-driven framework. They've essentially proven that you can scrutinize the high-risk 11% without suffocating the low-risk 90%. So the big question going forward is this: will Jersey's targeted framework become the ultimate global blueprint? Can we effectively starve out the bad actors without discouraging the charitable work that is literally designed to save lives? It's a delicate balance for sure, but as we've seen today, with the right control stack in place, it's absolutely possible. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking those big questions.